identifying discrimination and harassment. We want to begin with our basic concept from our law defining discrimination and harassment in our public schools. That's that 22-1-143. I said I would say it a lot, and here I am. Now, for our math teachers out there, we've got a short formula of three things that when you add them together, we have something that meets the definition in this law for discrimination and harassment. The first part of the equation is offensive and unwelcome conduct or communication. Not to worry, we are going to unpack each of these in the upcoming slides. The second part of the equation is that the conduct or communication is connected to a protected class. You are going to learn a lot about protected classes today. And the third piece we add to our equation is that what is happening to the student must meet a defined level of harm. This is important because conduct or communication has to rise to a certain level or type of impact in order to qualify as discrimination and harassment. A single comment or a one-time action might not get there unless it's serious. We'll talk through where the law draws that line. And just because it doesn't reach that line, I think this is important to say, doesn't mean that the conduct is okay or consistent with your expectations for how kids treat each other or how the adults treat kids. It just means that it might not qualify as discrimination or harassment if it doesn't meet that line. When we add these three things together, we have a situation that meets the definition of discrimination or harassment in our Colorado law for public schools. We'll go through a lot more on this. First, our first bucket, offensive, unwelcome conduct or communication. We'll start with some examples here, but first let's zoom out to the bigger picture for just a second. This law covers conduct or communication from the adults working in a school that impacts a student or students, and it also covers conduct or communication from the students or a student toward another student or students. When people talk about complaints, you might hear them referred to as, quote, adult student or student-student complaints. That refers to who is alleged to have engaged in the unwelcome conduct or communication and who is being impacted. The other big picture piece is that these are just examples of different types of conduct and communication. But frankly, students can get pretty darn creative about how to cause harm to other students, and sometimes the adults can too. So don't feel limited by what's here on the page. This is a broad category. Some examples, it could be physical conduct like a physical assault or damaging a student's personal property while at school. It could be sexual contact like brushing a student's breasts while passing them in the hallway. It also includes verbal conduct like the use of slurs or intentionally calling a student by a name or a form of address that they no longer use. A lot of things could fit into this category. It could also be a communication that tells a student that they can't participate in a class or extracurricular. It could be the words of a teacher that treats a student differently from other students. Other examples would come from written communication, like text messages or online messages or something written on a bathroom stall. Or they could be pictorial or visual communications, like drawings of offensive images, like swastikas or nooses. Or they could be, in our whole new world here, AI created images, or even nude photos of students. Any of these things would have to be unwelcome to qualify in this first bucket of our equation. For example, if students are using language with each other that is not unwelcome, then it's not going to be discriminatory. But a big caveat here. What if those same kids are joking around with each other and their language or conduct is impacting bystanders or people overhearing or seeing the conduct? That could fall into our bucket of unwelcome conduct or communication. even if it wasn't directed at the bystanders. In addition to being unwelcome, it must be objectively offensive. What do we mean by objective here? It means that your average person also finds it to be offensive. So it can't just be about how the one student feels. It has to be about what your average student feels. However, our Colorado statute also has a very important distinction here. It has to be objectively offensive to an individual who is a member of the same protected class. We have two examples here on the slide. One, if the communication is directed toward a Jewish student, you would consider whether your average individual identifying as Jewish would agree that the communication was offensive. Or another example, if the conduct is directed towards students with disabilities, you'd consider whether it was objectively offensive to individuals with disabilities. Another example, if the conduct is directed toward a Black student, you would consider whether it's objectively offensive to Black individuals. It is not a perfect science, and it may feel challenging to assess what is objectively offensive to a member of protected class, particularly when people have multiple identities or when you are not a member of the protected class itself. However, the more important part here is that we are not denying the offensive nature of conduct or communication just because we personally are not offended because we aren't a member of the protected class. We've finished the first part of our equation defining discrimination harassment in Colorado law. Next is that the conduct or the communication must be connected to a protected class. A protected class is a group of people who are legally protected from discrimination, harassment under federal or state civil rights laws because of the specific characteristics that they have. Different laws have different protected classes. We are focusing today on the Colorado law defining protected classes for Colorado public schools. Our protected classes covered in our law that we've been talking about, 22-1-143, are disability, race, color, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, religion and creed, age, national origin, ancestry, and family composition. And we will dive into these in more depth once we're looking at our examples because it's a lot easier to talk about in the context of examples. But for now, let's note that every single student is part of multiple protected classes. For example, everyone has a race and cannot be discriminated against no matter what their race is. Everyone has sex. Everyone has a gender identity. Everyone has an age. So to the extent someone says, I'm not a part of any protected classes, yes, you are. All students are. Here's another example. A school employee has been sending an increasing number of text messages to a student. They seem pretty innocuous at first, but now one of the texts hints, it's not totally clear, that maybe a kiss might help bring the student's grade up. If a student shows you this text, what are your next steps? A, listen actively, but don't ask the student for the whole story yet, because the student will have to tell it again to a Title IX investigator, maybe even the police. B, you recognize this as a type of sex-based harassment, conditioning a benefit on unwelcome conduct, here the kiss, and you're worried about what else it might be. You tell the student that this isn't okay, and you have to share this information with the Title IX coordinator so they can take some immediate steps to address this. You ask the student to take screenshots of the text and send them to you, and then reach out immediately to your principal and the Title IX coordinator. Or C, both A and B. Yes, it is both A and B here. It's important to listen actively because the student will see that you care, that you're taking this seriously. But when a student comes to you with something like this is a big deal. And you won't know whether it's the tip of the iceberg, whether or not the employee has actually already done something criminal. So it's important to get it to your experts right away, to your Title IX coordinator, to your principal, so they can help navigate the next steps, help determine if this is actually a mandatory report, and conduct the interviews. For a student who has been through a situation like this, it's Best practice not to have them tell the story over and over and over again to multiple people, but to try and make sure that they can tell that story as few times as possible. So here is both A and B. We added this example because it's so important to talk about the serious nature of grooming in the school environment. As educators, we have to be vigilant for signs of grooming by the adults in schools. There is no definition of grooming in Colorado law, and it's not technically a crime called grooming. However, it is still not acceptable. It can lead to the loss of a job and the loss of a license. Grooming is generally understood to involve a series of manipulative behaviors aimed at getting a minor's trust in order to facilitate future criminal sexual abuse. Things to look out for include unusual interest in a particular student by an adult that seems strange, excessive gift giving or special treatment, attempts to isolate the student from peers, or engagement in inappropriate conversations or physical contact with the student. If you suspect grooming, here are the actions to take. First, if you reasonably suspect that child abuse has occurred, which includes actual or attempted sexual touching or sexual acts between a school employee and a student, tell your Title IX coordinator and your school leader and immediately report it to law enforcement as a mandatory report of child abuse. If you don't suspect that something sexual has been attempted or actually occurred, but you see these manipulative behaviors that may be trying to groom a student for that future sexual abuse, contact your principal, contact your Title IX coordinator immediately, and they will help coordinate the next steps for what has to occur under your discrimination and harassment procedures. Okay, now we are switching gears to another protected class where there are high numbers of students experiencing discrimination and harassment in our schools, and that's national origin discrimination. National origin as a protected class covers individuals based on the country that they or their family come from or their ethnic background. These protections extend to students who are or perceived to be because of their shared ancestry or ethnic characteristics to be Jewish, Israeli, Muslim, Arab, Sikh, South Asian, Hindu, Palestinian, or any other faith or ancestry. It's a long list. Our first example here relates to a group of middle school Muslim girls. They are being called terrorists by other students, and some students are bullying them by pulling off their hijabs at school. This implicates national origin as a protected class. Under our second example, we see that Jewish students are being exposed to swastikas on whiteboards at school, and the bathroom stalls had white supremacist slogans stating conspiracy theories about Jewish people. As we mentioned before when we talked about the example of Sarah, sometimes harassment can be targeted to a specific student, and sometimes it can be directed to an entire group. It doesn't change your approach to respond. Now we're shifting gears again. I know this is a lot. And now we'll talk about 4 of our protected classes in Colorado law: sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. As we talked about before, Title IX protects students from discrimination on the basis of sex. You probably heard that there have been shifting and changing interpretations under federal law for what's covered under the umbrella of the term sex. However, those national conversations don't impact the fact that Colorado law covers these 4 things expressly: sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. We'll talk about those categories to make sure we have a basic understanding of the differences. But I also want to acknowledge that this is a statewide training and there are differences of opinion and beliefs on these topics. However, I know that we all agree that we don't want to see or allow kids to be bullied or harassed, no matter what the protected class is. If a student is being physically or sexually assaulted in the halls, we intervene, period. We don't think about what the student's protected class is to decide if we intervene. So I know we are on common ground here that we want all kids to be safe and welcome in school. Now, let's start with gender identity. Under Colorado law, gender identity is defined as an individual's innate sense of the individual's own gender, which may or may not correspond with the individual's sex assigned at birth. If an individual's gender identity is the same as their sex that was assigned at birth, that's called cisgender. Transgender means an individual has a gender identity that is different from their sex assigned at birth. Under our example here, we have a transgender student who was physically assaulted and injured by students who told the student to stop pretending you're something you are not. They call the transgender student by the name the student used before transitioning, that's called dead naming, and they intentionally use the wrong pronouns with the student, that's called misgendering. They aren't doing this because of their beliefs or because of their religion. They're doing it intentionally because they know it causes harm. They're doing it out of an animus and to bully the student. So we have unwelcome conduct and communications connected to a protected class, gender identity, that's creating a hostile environment for a student. Intervention is critical to disrupt what's happening to the student. Now let's talk about gender expression. Gender expression is defined in Colorado law to mean an individual's way of reflecting and expressing the individual's gender to the outside world, typically demonstrated through appearance, dress, behavior, the name they choose to use, how they choose to be addressed. This can apply to transgender or cisgender students. In our example here, we have a cisgender male student whose gender identity and sex assigned at birth are the same, but who expresses himself in ways that other kids mock as, quote, female, because he paints his nails and wears his hair long. Some students shove him into a locker and told him to stop looking like a girl. This category is really about our stereotypes, about how girls are supposed to act, how boys are supposed to act. And when students are harassed because they aren't conforming to those stereotypes, that is conduct or communication that is based on their gender expression as a protected class. Now, these two categories that we just talked about, gender identity and gender expression, don't have anything to do with who a student might be attracted to or what gender the student might want to date. Those two things are totally separate, and that is our next category. Sexual orientation as a protected class is about who the individual is attracted to. It could be the opposite gender from you, the same gender, or multiple genders. There are a lot of terms here: straight, gay, bisexual. And as an educator, we are making it our business to know who a student wants to date at school. However, it is our business if a student is experiencing harassment or discrimination because of their sexual orientation or the perception of their sexual orientation. For example, if a student is being bullied for being gay, it doesn't even matter if they are actually gay. It just matters that kids are harassing him because of their perception of who he is. That's sexual orientation. Whew. Now might be a good time to pause, take a deep breath, maybe do a big stretch. Let's acknowledge that we are moving really quickly here through protected classes, and this may be brand new learning for some, and it might be deeply personal and lived experience for others. So this is a good time for me to say thank you for being here and for doing this work, no matter where you are on the journey. We appreciate it. And we'll take that big breath. Okay, let's keep going on to our next protected class. This is likely one we are all familiar with at a high level. Students are protected from discrimination or harassment on the basis of their religious beliefs, their religious practices, and even their lack of religion. That protection applies to beliefs, practices, and observances, whether part of an organized religion or a sincerely held personal belief. This means students and staff are protected from discrimination based on what they believe, how they pray, what they wear, and how they express their religion. For example, a student who wears a hijab, a yarmulke, or a turban for religious reasons is entitled to equal treatment and cannot be excluded or harassed for that choice. Schools are required to provide reasonable accommodations for a student's religious practices unless doing so would cause undue hardship. That could include excusing absences for religious holidays, modifying dress code rules, or allowing quiet spaces for prayer, especially when the request doesn't interfere with the educational environment. For example, if a student asks to miss class for a religious observance like Yom Kippur or Eid, the school should excuse the absence and allow makeup work without penalty. And now another huge topic that we can't do justice to in the short time we have today: race and color as a protected class. Race as a protected class protects against discrimination and harassment because of racial identity or characteristics. Color protects against discrimination based on skin tone or complexion, and it can even be within the same racial group. For example, if a darker skinned Latina student is being harassed by her lighter skinned peers, that could be harassment based on color. In addition to skin color, race as a protected class also includes hair type, hair texture, hair length, and protective hairstyles. For example, a student cannot be told to cut their afro, their braids, or their locks to meet a dress code. That comes from our Colorado law called the Crown Act. In short, when you consider race-based discrimination, consider and look for treatment that's based on appearance, identity, or expression associated with race. And then shifting gears one last time, let's look at some examples related to discrimination or harassment on the basis of disability. This is a huge category and it can manifest in so many different ways, but here are a few. Unwelcome conduct or communication. A student with a mobility disorder is mocked by peers during PE class and the teacher dismisses it as just teasing. Does it meet the standard of harm or impact? The student stops attending PE class and receives a failing grade on the required course. There we have the impact. Another example. After a student files a complaint about inaccessible classroom materials, a teacher retaliates by removing the student from a leadership role in group projects. Does it meet the standard of harm or impact? The student faced retaliation for objecting to barriers and suffers reputational harm and loss of an opportunity. Yes. Another example. Staff repeatedly ignore a student's 504 plan accommodations and write the student out for defiance when the student leaves the room to manage a panic attack. Does it meet the standard of harm? The student is disciplined for following an accommodation in the Section 504 plan. Yes. There are so many examples we can talk about here, but I hope this helps see those connections between what is the unwelcome conduct or communication and does it meet the standard of harm. You have done a ton of work. We have walked through our examples. And as we come toward the end here, we want to take a moment to talk about the difference between harassment and bullying. There's a ton of overlap between the two and some simple ways to tell the difference. First, CDE has a fantastic bullying prevention model policy. If you want to do some additional reading on the subject, just Google CDE bullying prevention model policy to find it or use this link. The model policy notes that school bullying researchers typically define bullying by highlighting three components that differentiate it from other forms of aggression between students. The behavior is unwanted, it's repeated or likely to be repeated, and it's marked by an observed or perceived imbalance of power. Colorado law also has a definition on bullying, just to make it super interesting for you. Bullying is defined as any written or oral expression or physical or electronic act or gesture or a pattern thereof that is intended to coerce, intimidate, or cause any physical, mental, or emotional harm to the student. It is prohibited for any reason. I will say that again. It is prohibited for any reason, but the statute does give us some examples too. Bullying behavior that's directed toward a student on the basis of the student's academic performance, any bullying behavior that's directed toward a student based on disability, race, creed, color, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, national origin, religion, ancestry, or a need for special education services, or a pattern of bullying behavior that is directed toward a student on the basis of the student's weight, height, or body size. Did you recognize in this list in red that starts with disability that these sounded familiar to you? Yes, these are our protected classes. That means bullying is prohibited for any reason, including bullying that's directed toward a student because they are a member of a protected class. because they're female, because they are black, because they have a disability. And now you're thinking, wait, it could be both? Yes, let's talk about that just a bit. We had some text in green on that last slide and some text in red. In green was the bullying behavior directed towards student on the basis of academic performance and students' weight, height, or body size. These are not protected classes under our discrimination and harassment laws, and therefore they cannot be harassment. They can only be bullying. When you see these things happening where it's not connected to a protected class, we follow our local policies to respond to bullying. There was also some red text on the slide, and that included our bullying behavior directed toward a student based on their protected class. And then I had the list of protected classes. This type of bullying could be discrimination or harassment. Why do I say could be? Because we have to remember our third piece of the equation. Does it rise to the particular level of harm or impact to the student such that it qualifies? So there will be times when maybe it doesn't meet that level or it doesn't meet that definition. It can still be bullying. At the end of the day, you don't need to know exactly where this line is. And that is because you are not alone. It may be a lot, but don't stress. The most important part is to spot the harm occurring and connect with your experts. When you see that a student experience a harm from other students or the adults in the school and it seems like they're being targeted or treated that way because of their identity, share that information with your designated school or district expert who is trained in the nuances. And your local expert can bring into focus whether or not a protected class is implicated, what laws might apply, and the specific steps that need to occur to comply with those laws. I will say this again. The most important thing you can do is spot the issue and elevate it. This seems like it might be discrimination or harassment based on a protected class. Let me talk to someone about this. That's exactly right. It's our hope that this presentation can create some common language and common understanding around these issues so that everyone in your building can support each other in this work. I said this in the beginning when we first talked about the stories of students. You make a difference in what happens next in each of those stories. By spotting these issues, intervening in the moment, and elevating to your designated experts, you can make a significant difference in the trajectory for a student. We shift now to talk about how to respond in the moment. Every situation's so different, and let me just say that this is never easy. How often have you replayed situations and thought about what you could have done and could have said, and it's after the moment has passed? We all do. Our hope is that talking through some of the best practices can make it easier in that moment to make a choice that you feel good about for yourself and for your students. Our first best practice is to intervene immediately and calmly. Obviously, this looks different depending on whether we're talking about a physical altercation or a verbal one or both. And usually we're talking here about situations between students. But in any situation, our quick intervention is important for a couple reasons. One, stops the harm from escalating. Two, it models appropriate behavior for bystanders because the students are looking to the adults for cues on how to behave. Direct intervention shows the students that everyone deserves respect and the adults will stand up for them. Three, it can also prevent the normalization of bias. We don't want to send the message that, kids will be kids and we can't stop them from telling those jokes or using that language with each other or playing around with the slapping of body parts or other inappropriate touching. We set the culture. And ultimately, this is about the climate that you create at your school, and that climate makes a difference. So, in summary, we stay calm and firm, we interrupt the behavior, even if we aren't quite sure of all the details yet. Our second best practice is to separate and de-escalate. When we interrupt, we can separate the students who are involved in the situation and focus on de-escalating the tension and keeping all students safe. When possible, you can use proximity and redirection instead of direct confrontation. Like, Hey, James, can you come with me for a minute? If possible, use two adults to address students on either side of an issue. Hey, let's step over here so we can talk privately. Clear the rest of the students from the situation, if you can. Our goal in this moment is to focus on de escalating tension and keeping all kids safe. Third, when we're in a safe space and a student chooses to report a concern to us, we listen actively and we name next steps. I personally like to use a technique that's called looping. It's used by a lot of individuals who deal with some of the toughest conflict situations. And it's basically a form of active listening that people can see. When you hear something, you play it back to make sure you understand. Then you ask if you got it right. It sounds like this: I heard you say, then describe what you heard, and then say, did I get it right? It gives the person a chance to reframe, but also makes them feel heard. Now, I have to name a caveat here that some situations are serious, and you will recognize quickly that the student is going to have to tell their story to other people, whether that's the police or a Title IX coordinator or a dedicated discrimination harassment coordinator. In these situations, you don't have to be the investigator. You don't necessarily have to gather all the facts. You are doing intake to make sure that you get the student to the right person to fully tell their story. And you don't want to subject the student to additional trauma by having to tell you everything and then retell their story to another individual. So use your common sense here to assess how deep you should go on asking questions. It's a balance, right? Feeling heard, but also making sure that you recognize what happens next. No matter what, name any next steps that you can in the moment. You really will rarely know everything that's going to happen, but you can say what you can. Thank you for sharing this with me. It is really important to me that we get help from the right people in this situation to make sure you are safe. So I'm going to talk to the principal and our Title IX coordinator, okay? Now, our fourth best practice to avoid is what is called here victim blaming. And when I say victim blaming, I am referring to things like avoid questioning the behavior, clothing, or tone of the person that experienced the harm. Avoid suggesting that the reporting student provoked or was responsible for the situation or misunderstood the situation. Avoid minimizing the harm or telling students to change something about themselves to prevent future incidents. And I just want to acknowledge how hard this can be for all of us because it was really a natural feeling to want to tell students, I'm sure they didn't mean that, or I'm sure it wasn't that bad, to try and minimize the harm for them. But this can sometimes be victim blaming that we really should avoid. Here are some examples of what I would call blaming versus supporting. And at least this is really helpful for me, and I hope it's helpful for you too. So instead of saying, why didn't you walk away? Try, thank you for telling me. This really took courage. Instead of saying, maybe you should just try to ignore it next time. Instead, we don't want you to feel unsafe or harassed. Let's talk about next steps together. Instead of saying, I think you really just have to be a little more careful here. Try saying, you have the right to feel safe and respected here. Instead of saying, well, honestly, if you dress like that, people are going to say things. Instead, no one has the right to make comments about your appearance in a demeaning way. Instead of saying, they didn't mean it that way. Try, even if they didn't intend something, I want to focus on how it impacted you. As our fifth best practice, we recommend documenting the incident as soon as it's safe or appropriate. What that can look like is write down exactly what you saw and heard, note the date, the time, the location, people involved, any steps taken. You might have local practices, local recommendations from your folks, a particular form, put it in an email to yourself, whatever that might be. But the most important part is just to get the most contemporaneous statement of what happened. And then 6, report through your proper channels. I know we can't say this one enough. Follow your school's reporting protocol for the type of incident that you've got. If it requires a mandatory report of child abuse, take it to your local law enforcement and leadership. If it looks like discrimination on the basis of sex, like unwanted touching of private parts, sexual assault, domestic violence or dating violence between students, trafficking, sexual harassment between students or between an educator and a student, all of these things are going right to your Title IX coordinator for support. And this is particularly important for Title IX because there are specific protocols that must be followed in Title IX situations. So your Title IX coordinator thanks you. And best practice number 7 is to recognize the impact of trauma. Over 2/3 of children in the US have reported experiencing at least one traumatic event by the age of 16, and more than 60% of Americans have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. These are sometimes called ACEs. And 16.7% having experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. And these experiences affect our fundamental sense of safety, trust, and belonging. They affect how we are impacted by additional harms. So when we respond to discrimination and harassment, we can compound existing trauma if we aren't careful, or we can be a safe and supportive space that allows for healing. Here are a few common types of responses that you may see from students who have a history of adverse childhood experiences. Number 1 is your fighting, defensive or aggressive responses. That could look like yelling or using angry language, lashing out physically or verbally, arguing with staff or other students, seeming, quote, overreactive to what you perceive to be minor events. For example, a student lashes out yelling over what may seem like a minor incident. This could be a protective response that comes from a history of small cuts that have added up to a bigger wound for that student. To another type of response you might see is the flight response, which is a response rooted in avoidance or withdrawal. And third, I would call the freeze response, which can look like shutting down. Like you might appear dazed or blank or checked out. You might be unresponsive to redirection or questions, or maybe you have difficulty making eye contact or speaking. You might seem apathetic or numb to situations that other people might be responding in a really significant way. And lastly, you might see a response that your student attempts to be kind of either people-pleasing or self-blaming. That could be excessive apologizing or constantly taking responsibility for others' actions. Or it could be trying to minimize or justify the harm done to them, trying to avoid making a scene. These could be survival strategies that come from overcoming prior adverse childhood experiences. So when you're listening and watching for these things, it can truly help you respond in a supportive way in the moment. The core message that we are working on to create as part of an integrated culture at your school is this. In our school, everyone deserves respect. If we see or hear discrimination or harassment, we take action every time. That's what we want all of our students to truly believe. Now, let's talk about supportive measures and other concrete steps you can take when we have allegations of discrimination or harassment. Supportive measures are the steps that we take to, yes, you guessed it, support students after a report or an incident of discrimination or harassment. This could be while an investigation is going on to determine what happened, or it could be after you already have clarity on the issues and you're working to resolve or eliminate them. These are all called supportive measures. A note of caution before we jump in that some supportive measures can be provided immediately. Others should only be implemented after an investigation and a finding is made. And that's particularly important in the Title IX space. So you should consult with your designated contact on the appropriate timing for some of these supportive measures. Our first bucket of supportive measures are adjustments to make the environment safer for the students. This could look like classroom seating changes. You could move students away from each other in a shared class. This could look like schedule adjustments, where you actually change the schedules for kids so they have less contact. Maybe you change their lunch period, maybe even change their bus route to reduce contact. Or it could look like a safe entry or exit plan, where you allow the student or students to arrive early, maybe leave late to avoid interactions. Our second bucket of supportive measures are academic supports. This could be assignment extensions, where you provide flexibility for assignments or tests if the situation has affected the focus of the student or students. You could look into tutoring services, where you offer extra academic help to keep the student on track. Or maybe you're looking at quiet spaces to provide access for breaks if the student is feeling overwhelmed. Our goal here is to help provide an equalizing force. How do we keep the student at the same academic level that the student would have been if they hadn't been experiencing discrimination or harassment? We look at the academic supports for that. Our next group of supportive measures are counseling and emotional support. This could look like school counselor sessions, some regular check-ins with a counselor or psychologist. It could include peer support programs to connect the student with safe peer groups or mentoring programs. Or it might require some crisis intervention, some immediate access to mental health support if needed. Next up, let's talk about communication supports. This is such a critical one because communication can be the source of so much support and so much breakdown in the work that we do with students and with families. First suggestion is to designate a point of contact. So tell a student, this staff member is your person, and you can check in with them regularly when you're dealing with something that's associated with this issue. Second, regular updates. Keep the student and their family informed, recognizing that there are privacy limits, but let them know about next steps and changes and check in and see how they're doing. This could make a huge difference. And third, a note about interpretation. For families with limited English proficiency, ensure the availability of interpreters and translations of documents. Don't rely on the student to be the sole translator for the family. This can help make sure that families understand what's going on with their student and the student has the support that they need. Bucket number 5 here is another big one, monitoring and safety measures. There's a lot we can do in this space. One idea is increased adult supervision. So add supervision in the hallways, cafeterias, other areas of concern. Make sure if you have a student that, let's say, is doing behaviors that are sexual harassment, that someone has eyes on that student when they're walking down the hallway. Another area, behavioral contracts. You can use agreements to reinforce boundaries and safety expectations. 3, threat assessments, such an important practice. When there is a potential ongoing threat to the student or school, convene a multidisciplinary team to conduct a threat assessment and evaluate the risk of what is needed to mitigate risk. And the Office of School Safety in Colorado has some great resources on this if you need it. And finally, safety plans. You can develop a formal safety plan tailored to the student's specific needs.